In this episode, I am once again joined by Jason Miller, occultist, author, and teacher. Jason shares his explorations in Tibetan Buddhism, including life-changing encounters with Lama Vajranatha and famed ngakpa Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche. Jason recalls his months spent in Nepal, during which he received esoteric empowerments, conducted cave and charnel ground practice, and refused the offer of discipleship under a spiritual master. Jason also discusses encountering the goddess Hecate and beginning to teach a magical system associated with her. Jason compares Western ritual magic to the tantric sorcery of the Himalayas and considers the role of natural talent in spiritual accomplishment. So without further ado, Jason Miller. Jason Miller, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me back.
I'm so delighted to be talking with you again. I would like to very much talk about the magic systems that you teach, Hecate and St. Cyprian in particular. But I thought we might first start by tracing a side of you that we didn't go into a great deal of detail last time, which is your Buddhist side.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might begin by telling us, I believe Lama Vajranatha was your first Buddhist contact. I wonder if you might begin by tracing from that point forward your path in terms of Buddhism.
Yeah. So I am 50 now, and I met John, or I'm going to call him John from this point on rather than Lama Vajranatha, because that's what I've called him. This is what I call him now. It's not meant as any kind of disrespect or any kind of like, well, he's not a Lama or anything. He absolutely is. And easily my most important Lama as far as what really matters. So, which is knowing the nature of your own mind. So, but that said, I always call him John. So, because we met, when I was, I think, maybe 19 years old or so. And he was hanging out with the owner of an occult store in New Jersey, Sue, I think, Carberry. And they were friends from back in the 70s era of New York occultism. And when John was doing a stint in the United States, and he's always been, of course, interested in Western magic as well. So I was part of a group that was getting some like-minded people together at this store, and John was back in the States for an extended time handling his parents' estate. And so he would show up to these things, and he would give talks, and amazing talks. Just, sometimes maybe the person that was scheduled to speak would not show up, or they would flake, or they would have sort of a short thing. And you could just ask John to, talk about serpent worship, and he'd just get up and deliver like an excellent lecture on that. And so I knew him as like this kind of wacky occult guy with weird hair, right? And he put us in contact with the New York OTO Lodge, where he knew everyone there. And so he was sort of instrumental in that world. Like he introduced me to a lot of people in New York occultism, and he would talk about Buddhism, but I was always like, yeah, okay, cool. And so fast forward a few years later, I moved to Philadelphia. I get deeper involved in the Order Templi Orientis, and John moves to Denmark at this point. So I went to a festival called Summerhawk, and I won't say, exactly, substances were imbued. And quite a lot more than normal. And I remember I was sitting with another occultist named Michelin Linden. Now, at this time, I was actually considering I really wanted to deepen my practice, right? Like I really wanted to kind of tackle something traditional. And I was thinking of going to Haiti and getting initiated into voodoo. And I had bounced emails back and forth with Max Beauvoir, and at this festival, Louis Martinet, who's a New Orleans voodoo priest, was there, and I went to a ceremony he did, and I kind of got this message overall from Papa Legba that was like, we're cool, but maybe you don't want to do this. Like maybe this is a little too, too much for you, or too high maintenance, or, not where you should be. And I was a little like, oh, okay. All right. And then so later that night, as I'm, tripping, I sit down with Louis' wife, Michelin Linden, who had just come from a Kala Chakra empowerment. And she's waxing on about how amazing this was, and Tibetan Buddhists and so on. And all these things that John had said over the years that I knew him are sort of filtering back into my consciousness and making these connections. And then the rest of the night, odd psychedelic things happen, as they will. I won't dwell on them or make too much out of them. But I didn't speak for like 2 days. I was really like handling this like, no, something really happened. And so I go back to Philadelphia, and ironically, Tricycle Magazine that year, I get back, and my friend who was there with me called me up from Tower Books. He's like, you got to come down here right away. So I come down here, and he's like, look at the magazine that just dropped. And it was Tricycle Magazine. They did an article on Buddhism and psychedelics. It's like, it's a sign. So I was like, okay, cool. And then I tracked down John. I had his number and contact number in Denmark from when he moved. So I called him up, and I was like, all right, I think I'm ready. I want to tackle this. And so he proceeded to then give me some advice on how to approach lamas, how to avoid Dharma center politics and such. And, all really solid stuff. But of course, he was in Denmark and I was in Philadelphia, and he did come to visit a few months later, and he stayed with me for a week or so. But it was also around this time that I took my first empowerments in Maryland from Penna Rinpoche, and I was attending a Gelugpa center. Well, it was really a Rime center, but Lobsang Samten, who used to be an attendant for the Dalai Lama, and then played an attendant for the Dalai Lama in the movie Kundun. Actually, so he was really instructive as well, like oddly really forthcoming with some solid tantric advice, even in Nyingma material, right? So, this is back before the internet really exploded with knowledge, right? So I'd go to these empowerments, and you'd get bonked on the head, and, you'd get your sadhana script. And then that was basically it. These guys were out of there, and you've got this, thing that you recite. But this isn't the yoga part of it, right? This isn't the magic part of it. And so I remember I would take my Kila sadhana, my Ratna Lingpa Kila sadhana, like everywhere, and ask anyone I could. Glenn Mullen was instructive when he would pass through Philly. Lobsang Samten was amazingly instructive, and then later on gave me teachings on Guya Samaja, and we did that practice for a while. But eventually, and then of course I traveled around as lamas would visit, and took more teachings, more empowerments. I was lucky enough to go for a week Vajrakilaya empowerment with retreat rather with Khenpo Namdrol, who now since then had written a book on Vajrakilaya. And so I really I mean, I was collecting all these empowerments, but at the same time, I was really focused on Kila practice, Dzogchen practice, and, other just sort of learning my way around. And you get to a certain point where you ask questions of the lamas that would pass through in the summer, and they'd be like, well, look me up in Nepal. Khenpo Namdrol was like, come to Parping and we can go deeper into it there when I'm not on tour. And so that's what I did. It just seemed like the thing to do. So saved up some money and flew off Pakistan International Airlines to Nepal. John was going to be there at the same time. And so we made plans as to, when and how we would hook up. And I was there a month or so before John got there. And so before I even met John there in Nepal, I had really fortunate circumstance. My life has really been defined by unusual connections and fortunate occurrences of people just popping out of the woodwork. So I was in the Double Dorje, and I'd only been in country for like a few days, right? The first couple days in Tamil, and then I made my way to Boda, and I was still wondering, like, how does one even find out what's going on here, right? And I met a guy in the Double Dorje called Barche, and he still teaches in Scandinavia. So Barche at this time was like, well, I'm living in Parping with Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche. He's a famous ngakpa. And I'm like, yeah, he is. And he's like, why don't you come up? So I was like, okay. So hopped on a bus, came up, and as luck would have it, they are doing a 3-day Vajrakilaya practice for, the whole area. So I was up there for a day or two, got to know Rinpoche, got to know his wife, got to know Gyurme, his translator. And, I was staying there for a little while. And I was invited because at this point, I had shared that my main practice is Kilaya. So at that point, I was invited to come and practice, take part in this with everybody. So it was then that I had gotten my blessing to wear the ngakpa Zen and all that from Rinpoche, who, when I last saw Rinpoche, he was happy that I was growing my hair, but I explained that I would probably need to cut it when I got back. And so he was like, well, he tugged my beard and he tugged my ears and he pointed to my ears because I didn't have earrings at that point. And he was like, and Gyurme said he wants you to get earrings if you can't keep your hair long. I was like, okay, well, I can do that. So it was, and so for the next 3 days, I practiced in there. There were these other ngakpas who were mostly, I guess they were in caves on retreat, because they weren't living at the center. This was at Tsogyo Gefeljong, which was sort of a retreat center set up, I think, by Lama Tarchen, and some of the Arotur people funded it. And it was a lot of older ngakpa lamas. And I ended up living there for like a month and a half because it just, I practiced there, and then I continued to take teachings from Rinpoche whenever I could, and do practice with them and sort of live it. And we were right under under the mountain where the Asura cave is, so I would go and regularly practice. And here I am doing Kalaya practice in the Asura cave, right? Which is just mind-blowing. And at the same time, like, it's funny because you're like, I'm living this fantasy now, like, right? Like, I'm living this dream. I'm a yogi in the cave where where Guru Rinpoche really put together what would be the basis of the Nyingma teachings on Kalaya. But there's also like tourists coming out and going, and there's so you're kind of in a corner trying to very quietly do your practice. So it's where real life hits the fantasy. But it was great. It was mind-blowing. And then it came time for when John and I said we were going to meet up around Christmas. So I said my goodbyes. I said I should probably head back to Boda. And I came back to visit Rinpoche several times. And he was Kunzang Dorje was my assurance that sort of the most traditional way that this is taught was still alive and well, and on offer if you wanted to do the work. Because, of course, by this time I had been doing this several years of getting empowerments and quick teachings from lamas that would pass through, and Dharma centers and all this. And none of this sort of lives up to that Marpa Milarepa, the stories that we all read and hear. And so at one point, Rinpoche had said, well, because I had asked, like, how do we do this in the most authentic way possible? The way that you did it, right? I want to do it the way that you did it. And he said, well, if you want that kind of guru-student connection, then you live here for a year, you redo your Nundro, you do it here, and we get to know one another for a year. Because the kind of guru devotion that you're asking about has to be based on real exposure of me knowing you and you knowing me. Because then in a year we talk and we do 3 years of training. So here, and I'm like, well, my visa, and immediately, of course, from my end, I'm like asking about this, and it's like, here, this, you really want it? This is what it takes. And I'm like, whoa, and it was, at that point I was like, I'm glad that this is out there. At the same time, I think he knew that I would say, actually, I have to go meet someone in the city, and I've got other lamas that I wanted to connect with and talk to. So whether that's a failing on my part or just crazy wisdom on his part, sort of knowing that the fact that this was offered means everything, would be it was a great thing. But yeah, so I was looking at sort of the next 4 years. I was like, I don't have money. And he's like, have I asked you for a dime? Right? Like, you haven't spent any money here at all. In fact, at the end of the Kalaya, I got an envelope with rupees, just like the other ngakpas that were doing the puja with him. So I had he's and he's like, visa. He's like, oh yeah, we have ways of taking care of that. We'll go to India on foot, and then you can say you lost your passport or something, and we'll figure it out. So yeah, that was my experience with Kunzang Dorje, and he's the one that I was fascinated by, the fact that he had meditated in so many charnel grounds all throughout the subcontinent. And he gave me instructions for charnel ground meditation that had no sadhana attached to it. He's like, you don't want to, don't go in your robes and make a big deal. He's like, go to Pashupatinath, and you have to identify with the body in front of you. You have to, imagine that you are that corpse, and go through what it goes through over and over and over again over the course of days, which I did. It was, life-changing. So he was amazing. But then I did go back to the city, and I did hook back up with John. John gave me in Nepal the best introduction to mind that I've ever had. I don't know why it was the best, because I've had other lamas give me the introduction to the nature of mind. But I think it's just one of those things where maybe it's because I knew him already, but maybe it was because he followed it up with, your mind is like the sky, and so on and so forth. Now go every morning and sit on the Bodhanath stupa facing west in the morning and relax your mind, sit in the nature of mind, and just, cut through whatever comes. And then do it again in the late afternoon facing east with the sun at your back. And I did this every day for about 2 weeks, for an hour or so, no particular time limit. But it was really like 2 weeks of several hours a day, broken up between two sessions. And I hadn't seen John during this entire time, because he was staying in Swayambanath, which, for those that don't know, is sort of on the other side of the main city of Kathmandu. And I had that moment of recognizing this ultimate ordinariness that I think, is rigpa. And I had that moment, and then I was like, that's the basis of this practice, right? Like, I've arrived at the foot of this, of what this really is about. And I was so excited. I was like, I've got to go to Swayambanath and talk to John to get further instruction. And I looked to my right, and who walking through the gates of Bodha but John Reynolds, Lama Vajranatha. So it was like, again, it was like magic, immediate. Like, there he is, like right at that moment. So yeah, he introduced me to Lopan Tenzin Namdak over at Triton Norbutse, who gave me teachings on the heart drops of the Dharmakaya teaching from the Bon tradition. And I mean, these are the things that stick out from a very kind of busy, fractured, half year or so in Nepal. Took the entire Nyingma Kama from Mokso Rinpoche, as well as some follow-up terma lines that he gave there. And it was, that itself was just a wild experience, to have the entire, I was used to sort of more intimate empowerments rather than massive. I mean, I had been to some big empowerments in the States, but never like, community events where families are coming with their kids and It's like a concert every day for over a month. And you'd sit in the back and you want to, I was always taught, like, you want to be prepared to receive the empowerment, and I would meditate and be open. Meanwhile, like, there's a monk sitting next to me reading Time magazine, and just looking at me like, chill out, dude. Like, we're gonna be here for a month. There's a whole lot of this going on. You'll get it all. And then this was at the Katok Gompa, which was new in 1999. And but I remember the most amazing thing, because there was a day where I really wasn't paying attention at all. I was there to get the empowerments, but it was honestly, I probably was sick. I was disgruntled. I think I even brought a book. So I'm like sitting there while these empowerments are going on. And again, I'm not the only one. There's, many people at this point are just like, here we are. And I think I was reading like Tropic of Cancer or something by Henry Miller. So I'm in the back, like, reading these filthy, descriptions of sex. And but the most amazing thing, at these large empowerments, of course, they usually empower the Lama giving the empowerment gives the empowerment first, all the empowerments, to a whole coterie of lamas. And of course, Kunzang Dorje came down to Kathmandu for this. Like, it was a big deal. He very rarely at that point came down. Eventually he moved to Bodha, but it was really quite a quite a big deal. So there were a lot of lamas that get the empowerment, and then at the end they come around and give the empowerment to everyone in attendance that's not sort of higher up in the pecking order. And I remember this being the first day that I was really like, I'm here because I want to get this empowerment, but I really don't feel like being here at all. I wish I was in bed or at a coffee shop. And when the empowerments came, because I was in such a distracted state, not into it at all, but yet that the chinlaw in the substances so visceral, so real, that it was like instantly, it doesn't matter what you think of this right now. I mean, it would be better if you were in a receptive mode, but it doesn't matter, because this is real. And it's now hitting you because you were here and the ritual was done, and bam, there it is. Like, it's not something you've constructed in your head. This is a real thing that is damn close to the physical. And I left there just after receiving all the empowerment substances, completely in a different mindset, feeling like I was, I could have run home at that point. Because these are sort of just random memories, I guess, because I didn't prepare for the interview, so I'm just kind of riffing off. But yeah, these are things that stick with me. And so, and each one of these things kind of taught me something important about not just Buddhism, but about magic, spirituality, the nature of mind. Because of course, if these things are real, then they're real, right? Like, the nature of mind can't be owned by a group of people. It's the nature of everyone's minds. So these are things that when I finally did come back to the States and make a conscious decision to widen my my spirituality again to sort of incorporate the wider world of magic and occultism and so on. These are important things that stay with me and inform everything I did from that point on. And of course, the most important teaching that I give now is rooted right back into that time in Nepal, at Pashupatinath, in fact. So, it was a pivotal moment in my life for sure.
I believe it was in Nepal that you had what you've described elsewhere as a Hecate experience.
Yes, very strange. So as I said, Kunzang Dorje sent me to Pashupatinath for to meditate on impermanence for 3 days. It's actually quite funny because he gave me the instructions, and then I said, I'm going to go and do it tomorrow. And he actually said, no, you mustn't do this. And I think because there's something lost in translation, because he's like, you mustn't do this. This would be terrible. And I was like, okay, all right. And I just thought he meant like this practice, like don't do this charnel ground practice. But no, he literally meant don't do it tomorrow, because then the next day, Gurme came to me and he's like, Rinpoche wants to know why you're still here. And I was like, he told me not to do it. And he's like, no, he told you not to do it yesterday. I was like, oh, okay. All right, I'm out. So I was meditating on impermanence on the ghats at Pashupatinath. So for those that don't know, maybe more people are familiar with Varanasi, where they burn the dead on the steps outside at the on the Ganges. Same thing happens in Nepal at a temple complex called Pashupatinath. It's on the Bagmati River, and similar thing. So I would sit in the back because I don't want to be up where mourners and whatnot are. I don't want a front row seat where I'm disrupting things. So I'm sitting in the back, and I'm trying as best as I can to meditate that I am that person on the slab. And I got to know really well what the stages of a cremation look like, and how it all feels. And well, not how it feels, but a meditative idea of how it feels. And it leads you to this idea of impermanence that is way different than the intellectual knowledge of impermanence. Like, yeah, all things are, I'm gonna die one day, sure, but this is really, it's quite different. But at one point, everything falls away. So I'm meditating, and all of a sudden I can't see anyone there at all. It's almost like someone just took the landscape and just wiped all the people off. And this has happened to me before. This is similar to the things that happened to me when I was a young boy. But I also know that nyams happen, these weird things during meditation. And I, in particular, am prone to them. I'm one of these people, like, close your eyes and I'll just start to see stuff. And the trick then is discernment, right? Like, it might seem like, oh, you can see the astral, you can see spirits. Yeah, you got to cut through the gobbledygook to get to the good stuff, because otherwise, it's like watching scrambled TV. That's how old I am. I remember scrambled TV, being like 12, trying to watch the Playboy channel through the scrambled cable. Anyway, no one needs to know about that. So this woman appears in this landscape, and she's holding 2 torches, and she's wearing sort of a just a typical Greek dress. And I'm like, okay, not what I would expect from a Dakini. Doesn't look like Dakini, but sure, hi, what's, and I had this attitude very much of like, you're a distraction. I'm here to do this thing. I'm going to let you do your thing because I don't want to dispel it, but you came from nothing, you'll dissipate into nothing. And so it goes. But it also it had that quality of, this feels more real than reality. And I remember distinctly, she said, when you return home, you should offer me a supper. I have something to teach you. And I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. Sure. Cool. I'll do that. And, I realized that this was Hecate, or shortly after I realized that this was Hecate. And, obviously studying magic and witchcraft, even though I wasn't particularly into Hecate at that point, I probably had seen her image like at least 100 times at some point. So, nyams, weird mental stuff. Let it go. But it stuck with me in the way that some things do. And over the course of the next few months in Nepal, I did make the decision that rather than kind of go the John Reynolds route, where I would kind of keep going back to Nepal and learn Tibetan, which I'm never very good at languages. I've always kind of struggled learning languages. So, that was rough. I got a reading from Lama Dawa, who said, it'll take some work, but you can do it if you really want to. But I had decided that there was something about the openness of, I hate Western magic because I hate this idea of East and West. It's just a false division. But for lack of a better word, returning to the wider world of magic, right? And integrating what I had learned so far into what I had been doing that led me there. And so when I came back to New Jersey, I found a three-way crossroads. I actually moved in with a friend of mine who has a degree in anthropology and is somewhat of an expert in, Greco-Roman mythology and archaeology and so on. And so with his help, put together a nice Hecatean supper and the Orphic hymn. So I went to a three-way crossroads. I laid out some eggs and honey and 2 candles and prayed the Orphic hymn. And then arises Hecate, but now in this form that if people search for the Sorcery of Hekate, you'll see there's now been, well over a dozen people that have done the image in this way, that have taken the teachings and have sort of put down their artistic vision of her. But this sort of 6-armed, 6 legs, 3 faces, and in this way, very Dakini-esque. And as well as 4 attendant spirits, each one with an animal head, one with a bull, one with a horse, one with a serpent's head, and one with a dog's head. And it was explained that if I was up for it, there was a body of teachings that she wanted me to present, and a mantra. And at first I was really like, okay, I'll take this and I'll play with it. And I did, and fleshed it out a little bit and was impressed with myself. So I called some close friends. I was like, do you find this as awesome as I do, or am I just, on an ego trip? And they were like, no, this is great. This is, there's something here beyond something that you pulled out of your ass. And so then I continued to try to communicate, receive more. It was, people at that point were starting to say, oh, well, maybe you're like, the prophet of Hecate, because Aleister Crowley and all these other people that claim to be the prophet of somebody or other. And, Hecate was really like, yeah, no, you have a certain knowledge base because of your training and the way it's happened, and a certain openness. So you're not locked into that. So you're an ideal candidate for the job, but you're not you're not the founder of a new age or something like that. So and there would be a lot of no from Hecate. A lot at the time in the Western occult world in the early 2000s. Grimoire started to be published in these beautiful editions that we had never really had before, and in particular from England. People were producing these gorgeous limited edition hardcover books, and it's so funny because now I just find it all a little pompous, like, oh, I wrote something and there's only 70 of them available. They're bound in unicorn scrotum with, and I'm like, okay, really? Does it have to? Can't you just like publish it in a paperback so anyone can get it? But at the time I was really taken with this, and this is the direction things were going. And I was like, yeah, let's have a Hecate grimoire. And Hecate was like, no, this isn't a book. You need to actively teach it. You need to be available to answer people's questions. It's not a book. I don't want a book. So I was like, how about an article in this magazine Bahutet that I helped found in the 90s? And so there'd be like little snippets of this teaching popping out in an article there. In my first book, Protection and Reversal Magic, it was sort of like, yes, okay, this protection ritual is now solid. Now we're talking good 5-6 years after this started. So it's like, you can put this in your protection book. And I'm like, okay. And but it was slow going. And it was sort of like a cohesive practice that is still now unfolding, but the basis of it was solid to the point. It's like, you can now teach this. So I taught it to 2 people because I think, for me, I don't know about anybody else, but for me, learning something and developing something, the last step is actually sharing it and getting the feedback from the people that are not you, right? Like, does this make sense? And they see things that you don't see. They have questions. They find holes that you didn't see. And so I shared it with a couple people, and then I taught it as a course open only to people who had taken my strategic sorcery course, because at this point I had published 2 books and had done a year-long course in just general sorcery as I saw it. So I was already kind of, writing and teaching in a general way. And so then I opened it up there, and then I opened it up wider, and it's still growing. It's still like, this year is the first year that I'm going to have to run more than 2 cycles. So I'm going to have to run overlapping cycles because so many people sign up. I sound like I'm like patting myself on the back here, but the measure of something is not how many people sign up. Let me just say that some of the best teachings I've ever had are from lamas that hardly anyone knows. So it's really not about that. But obviously people like it and are benefiting from it enough that word is spreading primarily through word of mouth. And so it's very exciting. that this many people are interested in taking it further. And there's 2 follow-up courses for those that like really are just bonkers for it and want to go deep. And there will be sort of another coming up called the Wisdom of Hecate, at least tentatively called that. And I still get the smackdown. I still get, well, I want to put this in there. It's like, no. It's not that. And anytime when I was like, well, there's mantras and there's visualizations, but in Tantra we do this. And she's like, it's not Tantra. Like, it uses some of the techniques that you've learned through your tantric training, but this isn't a Tantra. Stop trying to make it one. So it's been an interesting and a wonderful 24-year journey now with Hecate. It's
fascinating indeed. And I'd like to ask you a bit more about that. But first, to loop back to your Nepal period, you were going to empowerments, taking many empowerments with different lamas. What was from your side, intention behind that? What was the idea you had as to why you wanted to be in these empowerments and take these empowerments? Did you feel it was leading to something, or was there, what was behind that collecting of empowerments?
Yes. So I am an enormous hypocrite, because I'll be the first person to say that Buddhism is a lot more than the collecting of empowerments. You need to seek teachings. You need to know how to do these practices. And honestly, you need to do more than just recite them, right? Like if you're, I think one of the things that the Gelugpa do pretty well is like, look, if you just want the empowerment, you've got a 6-session guru yoga you can do. You don't have to recite the whole text every day. And that's good for a lot of people. But like I said, after my first empowerment, which was a Vajrakilaya empowerment, that was like, I want to go deep. And there are a few more that I went deep with. I went deep with Kurukula, fairly deep into Zambala practices. But my reason for kind of running around collecting empowerments was really twofold. Well, really threefold. So the on the one hand, this is sort of at that time how you would meet a lama, right? They'd be giving an empowerment that's usually open to a lot of people, and then the teachings, if and when they were given, were usually a much smaller affair and circulated amongst the people that had the empowerment, or amongst the people in their circle. So the taking of different empowerments was a way to get to know different lamas. The other thing is, if in the future I took an interest in something that maybe I might have an interest in Mahamaya practice or Guya Samaja practice. And if you have the empowerment, it's a lot easier to go and say, okay, I want to go deeper into this. So, for example, Lobsang Samten we went through Vajrakilaya teachings and practice before I ever had the empowerment in Philadelphia. And then I received it as part of the Nyingma Kama. So it's unusual to receive Guya Samaja from a Nyingma Lama, but it is part of the Kama. It's part of the original Tantras taught by Guru Rinpoche when he was alive. And then years later, I sort of had a renewed interest in illusory body practice and also the dissolution of elements. Like I really, and this, in a way, I see connections where maybe there shouldn't be or aren't. So even in Dzogchen practice, the dissolution of elements makes me immediately think of the Guya Samaja practice. And yeah, one's Nyingma, one's Gelugpa, and But so if I was overly concerned with sort of authenticity in terms of tradition or history or staying within this lane, I wouldn't explore that. But I'm not. I'm more of a functional person, right? Like, is this real? Does it function in a way that I don't need to believe in it? It just does. So I wanted to take deeper Gurya Samaja teaching. So there was a group that was doing Gurya Samaja teachings online, and they're like, but you need to have the empowerment. So I'm like, sure, no problem. I told them where I got the empowerment, and I was like, it's not from a Gelugpa Lama. So and they're like, we don't care. As long as you have it, it's fine. One form of it, it's fine. And so different lamas are very different on this too, of course, because there are many that are like, no, you need this one and only this one. But there's no universal way that's done. So I remember one day at the Nyingma Kama, to go back to that, Moksa Rinpoche spoke with a very heavy, I think it was like a Dolpo accent. I'm not sure from what area he was. I'm trying to remember 24 years ago, but I couldn't keep up with all the empowerments that were given that particular day. And so I was outside after the empowerment, and I went up to the head of the monastery, and I was like, is there a list of what we're given? Do you know? And he's like, well, there's a list of the Nyingma Kama in the back of Dorje Rinpoche's. And I'm like, yeah, but like today, what was given today? He's like, I don't know, man. It's like, I don't know. He's like, none of us actually can understand everything he's saying. I'm like, oh, well, that's a relief. He's like, are you coming for the whole thing? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, are you coming for the afterwards? I'm like, yeah, as long as he's here, I'm here. He's like, well, from now on, when somebody asks if you have the empowerment, just say yes. And I was like, cool. All right. I love that attitude. So that was part of it, just to prepare. I mean, I'm not from from a wealthy family. I'm not a trust fund baby. So if I made the decision to keep going back to Nepal every year, it would basically be deciding that, half the year I would be working, not at a career, so probably some kind of lower paying job or something, eventually online work became a thing, but it wasn't really a thing back then for most of us. And I made the decision well, the circumstances for what I want out of life are not really leading me in this direction. So yeah. So this was sort of like, I got to make the most out of this. I don't know when I'll be back to Nepal, if ever. So yeah. And I still haven't. I don't even know if I'm allowed. There was an incident on Tibetan Independence Day where there was a riot in Bodha in 2000. And like a moron, I'm out there taking photos, right? Like I'm snapping photos of these conflicts between monks and the Tibetan police. And, I'm in the middle of a riot. And John was like, put your fucking camera away and come into the restaurant. Like, don't be a moron. And I was just like, no, I've never been in the thick of it. I want to take photos. So I did. And then my name got taken. And a couple of weeks later, my landlady was like, the police were here looking for you. And of course, I'm like, holy price. So they give a phone number. So I went to my friend at an internet cafe and I was like, can you call and see what they want? And immediately they're like, where are you? And I'm just like, what do you want? And they're like, we just want to talk to you. So I hopped into a cab and went to the American consulate first, because I was just like, I don't know what's going to happen, right? I don't know what they want me for. And of course, none of it was as serious as I was afraid of. Like, I'm ducked down in the back of this cab, like they're actually looking for me, like I'm the spy movie. And, at one point we get stopped by a police officer who just wants bakshish to continue on his way. And I was just like, oh my God. And then the American consulate is just like, I don't know what you think we do here, but we can call and let them know you're coming, and that, we'll call tomorrow to see if you're in jail. But we'll call your parents, but we don't get involved in this kind of stuff. If you broke the law, then, you're up shit's creek. You're not a diplomat. So they did call, and I went, I was assured it was like not a big deal. And I went down and they were like, we're checking up on people who are in country for a while. And I'm like, okay. And it was all very cordial at that point. I don't know if it's because they got a call from the consulate first or not, but it was all just a tea. And then they wanted to know what I did for a living. And then when I said, at that point I wasn't working, but I sometimes work at my dad's hardware store, they're like, so you're not a journalist? And I was like, no, I'm not a journalist. Okay, because we had you down as a journalist. And that's when I put two and two together. I'm like, oh, I was taking photos of, this incident. So, but I'm sure it's not a big deal. Like, nobody cares.
I'm curious what you think of the magical potency of those systems of practice, particularly the magical potency
of Tibetan systems.
Right. And how would you compare that to the other systems that you've been involved in?
Well, they're certainly, they are magically as potent as other systems. I would love to, and I think, there's probably a lot of people who will listen to this that want me to say they're more powerful because people take it more seriously, and there's more, but I can't. It's much more about the wand than the wizard. It's much more about the wizard than the wand. I have met lamas that are, tulkus from, families that are important, that I'm fairly certain couldn't conjure their way out of a paper bag. And I've met people that, do the simplest folk magic. I've met, I know a little Italian lady in New Jersey who's Catholic and, but knows the secrets of how to work with the saints and how to burn candles upside down and things like this. And, I'd put her up against a lot of them any day. There's a lot of factors that go into it. Some of it is gift, some of it is training, some of it is in fact the system that you're training in. I will say certainly I've never met as true a wizard as Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche. And in that sense, you can say, that's like the guy that Jason thinks of as like, he can, read minds and do things that are paranormal on a fairly regular basis. But again, I don't necessarily think that it's the system. I think it's both him and the time that he's put into it. And, you know, he lives in the spirit. Sometimes, you know, to the detriment of the material. You know, I remember him asking me to go get a bottle of whiskey if I wanted him to continue teaching. And Jomo, his wife, asking me not to go get a bottle of whiskey if I wanted him to continue teaching. And her explaining, he just sees his channels. When he thinks of his body, he is the Sambhogakaya. He is, you know, or it's the Nirmanakaya. There's a central channel, a left and a right channel, and the nadis and winds. He doesn't think about his liver. And, you know, is that good? Is that bad? Is that admirable? Is that not? I think that these kinds of scales are not the correct measurement for it, right? It is what it is. And so I really do think that it's much more about the wizard than the wand. Yeah. I think that there's a certainly having the right tools and a solid system is really helpful. I don't think that people can I don't think dedicated people will succeed as well with something that is just made up. But at the same time, I'd put my money on somebody who is super dedicated to something that maybe others think is made up versus somebody who does the bare minimum at a very old system, right? So it's hard to say. I try, when students ask me questions like this, I always say, look, it's not Pokemon. There's not like, you know, like Karukala doesn't have this many hit points and Palden Lamo has this many hit points, so who would win in a fight? It doesn't work like that. But so it absolutely compares as a magical system. And there are certain blessings because it is so old, it's passed through so many hands, it's been the commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries upon in any given practice that you do. It's an amazing resource, right? But at the same time, it can also handcuff you. It can also be stifling. Because when you're in this and there's 1,000 years of people inputting and something occurs to you, well, who are you to claim something happened to you that's important? Have you read everything there is to read on this yet? Well, no, of course not, because I would be dead by the time I read everything there is to read on it. So to a certain extent, systems like this can be stifling in their complexity. And they can also suffer from over complexity, right? I remember a monk once telling me, because I was saying, I forget what sadhana we were doing. I think it was a Karukala sadhana, and I was doing it in a room full of monks. And I remember how just, man, it's really weird sitting in a room full of celibate men just talking about how they see themselves as a naked 16-year-old sexual, I always try to boost it to 18. Let's move it to 18 for our audience. But You know, like just as a Westerner, I guess like the oddness of that hit me. But then I was like, you know, why this focus on chanting the visualization? Like certain things like the invocations and the mantras and offerings obviously meant to be spoken and chanted. But sadhanas where we're actually saying, you know, and I dissolve my body and now I re-arise as this. And it's always been like, man, I can either talk about it or I can visualize it and really throw myself into the experience of it. But I don't see how you do both. I can see how you can invoke and then alternate, but I can't. And the Lama that was there, whose name I don't remember, I'm terrible with names, he said to me, yes, in the old days, we would all have to visualize. But through the lamas, through their incredible blessing, have made it easier for us. And now we only have to recite. And so what he was thinking of is like, this is a great thing because we don't need to do all this to keep our commitments. And then we can get about doing the other things we do during the day. And as somebody that's approaching it from like the magical angle, I'm like, oh God, this is terrible. Like, what an awful thing to happen. But if you look at how kind of long and baroque some sadhanas become, you can kind of look at that and say, okay, this is somebody who had an excess amount of time available and you know, wanted to fill it up. And so it's interesting to take things like Parkinson's law and apply it to ritual and religion. For those that don't know, Parkinson's law is like a business term, and the law is that tasks expand to fill the time allotted for them, right? So if you give someone 2 weeks, it will take them 2 weeks. If you give them 3 months, it will take them 3 months. And at the end of the 3 months, oh, I got it in just under the wire. So you have to be mindful of this. But I'm always aware of Parkinson's law when I sit down to do a practice. And I was like, okay, was this a yogi? And what did they value in this practice? Or was this a monk and who, you know, I remember, you know, my first Kilaya sadhana actually had at the end, like this sadhana was put together to stop those ignorant ngakpas from putting it together. And I was like, oh. So it's, you know, I look at all magical practices through that lens, and I'm sort of like, you know, when you look at the practice that way, you can see, oh, well, you know, were there a lot of tools available? And you can look at Western magic the same way. If you look at some grimoires, they require an ostensorum and you know, epiphany chalk, and basically what a priest would have available. So the priest has all these things available, so he's using them in the ritual, and he has the time to do it. So he's using the ecclesiastic tools and the exorcisms that he has available. And it's great. I love that stuff. But does it mean that magic doesn't happen outside of that? No, because we also know that people without a pot to piss in who can't read also have been very powerful and famous practitioners of magic. So, you know, it's something I always keep in mind. I'm a heretic.
Yeah, very fascinating indeed. Perhaps I'll ask you one more question, then I might have to propose a third installment, you know, because something that I'd like to get into, which is too long for now, is this, you describe it as having a relationship with various entities, like Hecate or Saint Cyprian and that sort of thing. And you also talked about grimoire magic, and from what I understand, the fashions of Western esotericism, sometimes one holds more sway than the other. Downloads over, you know, pouring through the Latin or whatever the case may be, or the, you know, Arabic or something.
Yeah.
So I think I'd like to ask you about that and how one establishes and navigates such relationships, and what is that like as someone who clearly has a lot of experience with that. So I think that would be a fascinating episode in and of itself.
Let's do it.
Great. Okay. Well, then maybe I'll close with this question. You talked about gift as one of the factors. There's the system itself, there's the work one puts into it, and then also there's this gift aspect. And I was recalling as you were saying that, of course, you yourself had strange paranormal experiences as a child. John Reynolds, who we've talked about, aka Lama Vajranatha, also had those. He had spirits appearing to him and all sorts of things. So I suppose that's one way a gift is obvious. I wonder if you might say something about this gift. Is it like height or IQ or tolerance for alcohol? How does one know if one has a gift? What are the pros and cons of having a gift? And what about those who are, shall we say, paranormal duds? Are there such people, blanks, who have as much, shall we say, spiritual potential or paranormal potential maybe as the kitchen table?
So, man, where to even start? I mean, there are so many traditional ways that people are said to be gifted, right? You know, in Tibetan lore, you've got rainbows appearing, and of course, you know, prophecies of tulkus and things like this. You know, in the West, you've got the seventh son of a seventh son being gifted, or people born with a call, which is the amniotic sac over the face, and said to be gifted in sight and things like this. I didn't have any of that, as far as I know. So, but in the end, I do think some people have an aptitude or a gift or a talent towards a certain aspect of spirituality, for sure. So John and I both had spiritual experiences, and a lot of other people have had experiences with spirits. And maybe that's, you know, maybe it's something that's broken, is always something that I've thought of. Maybe it's not a gift, maybe it's a flaw, right? You're seeing of something that you shouldn't necessarily see. And if we were raised in a different area, maybe we would have been subjected to exorcisms and beatings and things like this until we learned to just shut up about it. And then some people, they have this capacity to the point that they get involved in magic not to see spirits, but so that they can get the spirits to shut up. You know, that these things are intrusive. That's happened to me every now and then, where it's sort of like, this is actually intrusive. This is now, you know, an annoyance. You have to go, you know, you have to respect my space. So magic is helpful in being able to manage that. There is also the fact that people who are gifted, especially in sight with visions and things like this, because we have that capacity, we also have that capacity for things that are not terribly important, right? So I've noticed something in my students. There are some students who, like me, visions come easily. They invoke a being. Chances are that being's going to show up in some way, shape, or form. They're going to have an experience of that. That's true of me, right? And then there are other students who are, as you said, spiritual duds or head blind, as they sometimes say, and they sit and they don't get that. But when I really parse this out with people, not just myself, but I have the blessing of having a sort of a sample body of people to really like pick their brains on this about. I've noticed something. It's better to focus on, rather than was this vision real? Was this really, Garib Dorje that appeared? A better question is, did you get anything that was useful or meaningful? Is this actionable? And like, is there something that you garnered from this that is meaningful, that you can either, helps frame reality as you experience it, or is useful in some way to further your goals in life or spirituality or whatever it is? And if the answer is no, then we don't need to dismiss it as false or true, because it doesn't matter, right? It's just a thing that happened. That happened, and we don't need to dig much into it. And what I've noticed is that when people dig deep into every last thing that they see, that's when they end up wildly bouncing from one thing to another, not on a yearly basis or a basis of decades, but day to day, week to week, because they saw a show, and then now they have a dream about something that they saw in the show, and now they want to explore that. And it's amazing, for instance, when Breaking Bad was on and they had the episodes about Santa Muerte, how many people were suddenly called by Santa Muerte? Were they or were they not? Were they people who have visions easily and they saw something that packed some spiritual power, even though it's on a TV show, that imagery is still powerful and it triggered sort of a sequence of dreams or feelings or visions? Was it in fact a trigger of Santa Muerte reaching to them, or was it them fantasizing and their capacity for second sight kind of lifting that fantasy up and making it seem like more than a fantasy? So I always tell people, like, ground it back to reality, like take it back down to the material. Now, that said, I teach people who are in the world and doing this. If I was a professional contemplative who was running, some school in the Himalayas, it might be different. Yes, go wild and explore the vision. The material world doesn't matter all that much. But, I always tell people, like, ground it back down. How is this meaningful? How is this useful? Explore that. Let that be your cornerstone. And then people that are those spiritual duds, so to speak, when they apply themselves to practice, two things happen. One, the parts of spiritual practice that are magical, that are, for lack of a better word, spell effects, they get really good at them. They get really good results. So when they're sort of like, okay, layoffs are coming, I'm going to do Black Jambala practice to overcome these obstacles and continue my expansion of wealth, they get good results, right? They're not having a vision of Jambala, but they're getting what it is they asked for, what they did the magic for. If they're pouring the water over white Jambala, they're getting their petition fulfilled. So perhaps it's a matter of them being better senders than receivers. And between the two, I'd rather be a sender than a receiver, quite honestly. I'd rather be able to be functional than just, woo, I live in a phantasmagoric wonderland, you know? But the other thing is, they will have spiritual experiences and visions less often, because eventually with practice, something will happen that breaks through, right? That is just so potent, it doesn't matter what your mindset was. It doesn't matter whether, you know, your gift or not. It just reached out and grabbed you all the way. And when that happens, it's almost always actionable or useful, because these are not people prone to that. So whatever it is that got through that is going to have some teeth to it. It's going to be important. And that people can make themselves headblind at times. I think, you know, on the one hand, I'm always telling people, look, analyze this. Don't just accept it for what it is. Like I said, is it useful? Is it meaningful? If not, you don't have to even worry about it. Don't judge it as false or real. So people sometimes think that the key to success is being very critical of these experiences, but not when they are happening. When they're happening, the best thing to do is roll with it. Do all that critical analysis afterwards. You've got to roll with it. Otherwise, it's like learning to ride a bike. I taught my kids to ride bikes differently, but when I was taught how to ride a bike, my dad would hold the bike and I'd pedal and he'd run alongside and then he'd let go and he'd be like, you know, I'd ride and he'd be like, buddy, you're riding on your own, at which point I would fall. And I think this is a universal experience of everyone that's learned how to ride a bike this way. By the way, if you're teaching your kids how to ride a bike, just take the damn pedals off, let them scoot around with their feet and then pick their feet up and they'll learn to balance and put the pedals back on. Within a half an hour, they'll know how to ride a bike. Anyway, sorry. I'm very passionate about that now. Where was I? So people will have this experience that's unfolding and they'll be like, is this real or is this not real? You know, well, this could be my mind. It probably is my mind. All right. Yeah. I'm just daydreaming. And then it goes away. That connection is lost. They've fallen off the bike because they realized that no one was holding it for them. So you just kind of have to roll and let it go and stop worrying about whether it's you or not. When people do astral projection, where they're, you know, embodied in the spirit, not just having a spiritual experience, but the idea of leaving their body. I know the big hang up for me was I would have this experience. I would be having the experience of being outside my body. But then I would think, can I feel my body? And I try to feel my body and I'd instantly be back in my body and think, oh, well, I guess I was just daydreaming. And then finally, a teacher of mine said, well, you know, if you're not dead, you can feel your body if you try to. Like, if you're astral projecting and you think, you know, can I wiggle my toes, and you can't wiggle your toes, you're in a lot more trouble than just not being able to astral project, buddy, because you're, you know, you're dead or, you know, close to it. So again, it's that idea of letting that go. And I think people do this in Tantra too, right? They're Om Svabhava Shuddha Sarva Dhamma Svabhava Shuddha Hum, and their body is supposed to dissolve, and then they re-arise as a syllable which radiates light, and then they become their meditational deity, and they have the experience of being this deity, but then they're like, but I can still feel my body. And then when I turn the page of the sadhana, I still, so you just kind of got to let it go. Ride, like flip back and forth. Don't judge too much. Afterwards, if there's something to judge, then get critical, then parse it out. But yeah, so almost no one that I've met is really just ungifted, head blind. But it's like music, right? Like I've met some people that are naturally gifted at music. They were young and picked up a guitar and instinctively, like no one taught them scales. They just realized that these notes sound good together. But there's very few people who can't play guitar at all, right? I love to play guitar. I am ungifted at playing guitar, but I love it. I've got short fingers, if you can see them. My palms are big, my fingers are short. If I've got to stretch across 4 frets and I'm not doing hand exercises, I ain't making that chord. But I still play guitar, right? So it's a lot like that. If people focus too much on am I gifted or not, they'll lose the benefit of it. Right? You don't have to have this special gift from birth. And in some cases, maybe it's better that you don't. Maybe it's better that you are working for what you get, because the gifts do often have a downside. As much as I was able to just weirdly, teachers in high school that I would talk about this stuff with, remarked how like, wow, this is like, graduate level text that we're talking about, and you're conversant in it, at least to ask the right questions. I'm sort of amazed. Why can't you do this with your schoolwork? And I don't know. Maybe it's ADD or maybe that but maybe it's that this is, whatever capacity I had in this in excess is lacking elsewhere. Like I said, I have a lot of trouble with languages. Not when they're written, but, as far as memorizing languages. I mean, I can translate things with the internet like anyone else and then go to somebody who actually knows what they're doing and have them look at it and correct it. But so
Jason Miller, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.